Whatever time you're tuning in the program called What's Going on FlintTalkRadio.com. I'm George Moss, the host of the program, and we are delighted as always to see you out there, knowing you out there in the viewership. We always say see you out there. We can see on the count that you're there, but you're looking at us, right? We're not able to look back. Although on TV programs, they try to make it appear that they can see you out there and say, we're glad that you're tuned in. We assume you're there and haven't gone to get your coffee yet. And I have my cup of coffee here, so we're ready to go at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Don't forget, we're here every Monday from 2 to 3. And after this program's over today, given the fact this is the second Monday of the month, we'll have Satora's Black History Corner coming on at 3:30, and they'll be on for about 30 minutes. We're here for an hour. And so sit back, relax, and enjoy the program. We're going to bring you some, hopefully some information that you can take to the bank. We try to be accurate here at FlintTalkRadio.com because we're trying to become the #1 studio in all of the United States. And want you to stay tuned to all the programs here at FlintTalkRadio.com. And I'm sure you're enjoying the programs that we're working hard to make sure they're up to the quality that we require here at the studio. We're going to take over from CNN, MSNBC, and Fox, and they're going to be tuning in here to get the news and all of the latest things that are happening on the national scene, also the national scene.
In the next few years, we hope Obama's going to criticize us, saying we're the cause of the problem, like he did Fox. Yeah, I mean, did you see that? Where he claimed it's Fox News' fault. It's Bush's fault. It's Fox's fault. I just want to be a tyrant. Nobody should point out that I'm on my way to doing it. Yeah,
it's really amazing when you listen to the president. Nothing is the president's fault. For 4 years, it was Bush's fault. And now that we have to go through 4 years of his own administration to get to Bush, it's no longer Bush's fault. It's now the one network that's not in the camp, that's not an extension of the Democratic Party, and does not have an unofficial affiliation with the DNC. It's now that one station that's out there that's reporting the accurate news of what is really going on in Washington. It's now their fault that the president's numbers are going down.
Now, how are they going to explain that, people voted for Obama, yet the viewership for Fox allegedly has increased? I don't know how they really measure it, if it's accurate, but that's another issue. But, yeah, I mean, how come everybody's listening to Fox News, but they want Obama as president, and they're on board for everything he wants? Why are they watching Fox to bolster their president when they're not doing it?
Yeah.
Doesn't make sense to me, but...
Well, the American people do not elect presidents because they want the presidents to fail. Let's get that straight right away. And we want our presidents to succeed. But this president is not like any other president we've had in the past. We're not going to allow him to make it appear that any criticism we have of his presidency is because he is black and that we had no criticisms prior to him taking over the office. That's just fundamentally unfair for him to make that allegation. And it has no resonance in terms of how we've treated all the presidents going back to the very beginning, pretty much, after George Washington, because the founder of the country had a certain standing with the American people at that point. But go look and see what they said of all the ones who are the successors down to the 44th president of the United States. And none of them have been given a pass.
No, I mean, the majority of the media has been very kind to them, like kids shed gloves. I mean, you don't see him as ridiculed as much as on Saturday Night Live. They don't see him as lampooned as often or as viciously as you saw Bush or Reagan. Oh, my God, Reagan was, when he announced he had Alzheimer's, I was at U of M. I was working there. And the faculty and staff members, some of them were just saying horrific things about how he deserved to have Alzheimer's and how they hated this man. I went, totally undeserved stuff. I mean, I didn't like the guy because he violated the Constitution. I wanted him to serve prison time for that. Mm-hmm. But I don't wish Alzheimer's on Bill Clinton or Obama. And I can't stand either one of those guys.
Yeah.
I don't wish Alzheimer's on
This
them.
is not about race, and they can bring that up as a impediment as to why persons can't get to the great things that this president is in fact doing. But what is the president doing that has come out to be so great? And what has the president done over the last 5 years has benefited this country? And I mean, we're on a downward spiral here. And to say this is about the president being black as if we just discovered that last Tuesday when he was black when he ran for office in 2008. And there was a crusade going in this country because the country was pulling for this president to come in as somewhat of an outsider. He had been in Washington for 2 years, but he was pretty much an outsider when he was elected president because he had only been in the Senate, for 2 years prior to becoming elected as president. And this country gave him a chance to run the country with a very poor resume. I don't think they would have given very many whites this leadership mantle with the kind of thin resume that this president had. So this country was pulling for this president to do well. And it's disingenuous for the record to be what it is right now and have him to say that it's his ethnic background, which is as much white as it is black.
Actually, more so. Because, I mean, how many blacks does he really know where the run-of-the-mill average black person who struggles for a job and like the average white person, how many people does he know like that fit that bill? I don't think I think he'd be terrified if he actually met a real, genuine, down-to-earth, normal black person. I don't know, though, if he could handle that.
I don't see anything that would make it appear that he's been the black people's president, and I don't think any of them can claim that, no matter how much the support is that he gets from the black community, which was upwards of 95% in the last election. But we have to be real here, and this president does not get a pass. And I have to add to that and say that there are two kinds of racism. One racism is when someone would attack the president because he's black, and then those who give him a pass because he's black. And I think that it's more of the latter case than it is the former, by far, that this president's gotten far too many passes given the record. And even the black leadership has said that if Bush had the record in terms of the numbers that we have with this president as far as the effect of his policies on the black community, we have these escalating unemployment figures higher than they are of any other group and higher than they've been in the past. And we also have the unemployment rate among the general, not only the teenagers, but also the general population of blacks. If that were Bush's statistics, if these statistics held up under the Bush administration, even black leadership, the Congressional Black Caucus members have said that blacks would be out there in the street demonstrating. And so this president has gotten passes when he hasn't deserved passes. And to give him a pass because he's a black president when he deserves critique and criticism for the policies he's putting in place, that in and of itself is racism.
Oh, yeah, because, I mean, he puts himself in the position of the cutthroat world of politics, yet we're supposed to exempt him from having scrutiny put on him. I mean, come on, when he initially ran as president, I've seen people who have to go through more vetting and more investigative process on their background to adopt a pet than they did for Obama being run as president. Mm-hmm. I'm not joking. I'm not being the least bit overly exaggerative in that.
I agree with you 1,000%. And I don't mind stating that publicly. The truth is the truth. And this president has done some things that's been injurious of the country, and certainly has been injurious of the black community, which always has been the one that when the country catches a cold, then the black community catches pneumonia. Not because of discrimination, but because of a lot of other things that are going on in the community. They explain why the community is not making the kind of progress other groups are making. And if you're not practicing the things that bring about progress, then you're going to have less progress than those that are practicing those things that will bring it about. So there's nothing shocking about that. But to lay that at the door of race, the bugaboo that we always use to try to explain why this phenomenon does take place, is nonsense. And this president's gotten to pass, and it's almost like in a lot of quarters that he can't do anything wrong, regardless of how injurious his policies are. And I think we have to be normative in our critique, and that is to say that what's good for the goose has to be good for the gander, so to speak. And if you're going to critique one person because the policies may be injurious, then you have to critique the other person if it's even more so the case. And not to do that, to me, speaks of racism. And I'm not buying that only one group can be racist and other groups cannot be racist. All people can be racist if they're engaged in racist conduct, including those of you out there that's not saying anything about this knockout which is one guy was saying he who got caught said it was a game. It's not a game. It's nothing other than depravity on the part of those who are practicing it. And I've noticed the silence of those who only come out there and say that's wrong. I don't see Spike Lee and these others that were very quick to jump to the defense of the Martin family, even though the facts were on the table about what really happened the night that Trayvon Martin was killed. and they're even more clear now than they were then. And they still haven't retracted some of the comments they made, yet they have nothing to say about the things that are happening that these youth are out there doing. And we had a baby, a white child that was shot in a crib and killed, shot in his head while laying in a baby crib, and nobody said anything about that. I haven't seen anybody out there denouncing that and saying that was a heinous act. I don't know where these people come from that they think that racism has to do with what one group does, but they can't be racist themselves in terms of what they're doing. And those fingers, when you're pointing, 3 of them come back toward the pointer. And we need to start putting some focus on those other 3 fingers that are coming back, pointing to those persons who can see all the things that are happening across the street and in other communities, but can't see anything that's happening right next door and really happening from their own vantage point from what they're doing. And we've got to be real about that. And I like to call it, if it's wrong on one side, I'm willing to say that's wrong, because the principle is what you have to hold on to. And if it's wrong and the principle has to be upheld, then it's got to be upheld both over here in this particular corridor and in this chamber over here when it occurs. It has to be held as being the principle over here also. And you cannot be cherry picking and choosing when you're going to be virtuous and be outraged over those things that have no virtue. You got to be consistent with your premise that you are acting a moral way. And if anyone's acting immoral, regardless as the perpetrator, you got to call that. Or you're just talking out of both sides of your mouth. And we have enough of this hypocrisy going on, and we need to call it what it is. So this idea that the president is beyond criticism, and anyone who has that point of view, the point of view is racist, that he's above critique. And I have been on my Facebook wall, as a matter of fact, inviting people to show me where these policies that have been put in place over the last 5 years have done anything other than bring one injury after another to the country. This country is being injured by these policies. Before I came to the studio, by the way, I was reading a Facebook post, and one of the persons stated that they're planning a march. They hope to bring, I don't know if you're going to be able to bring this many. You're talking about 10 million people there. I don't know if you can get 10 million people in that small city. Don't forget, it's only 10 square miles wide and long. And so we're not talking about like a humongous place to start out with. And you can get congested just with the 250,000 person that showed up on August 28, 1963, when Martin gave his I Have a Dream speech, and the 500,000, which I think was in the mall when I was there on 8/28/2010, when Glenn Beck called his rally. And I was saying, if you're going to have one meeting in May of this year, May the 16th, I was told is the day they're going to be meeting again in Washington, to ask for some folks in Washington to stand down from their positions because of the injury they've done to the country. They didn't mention Barack Obama's name. They mentioned Nancy Pelosi and mentioned Harry Reid and some of the others. They should be mentioning John Boehner and a whole host of those persons, in particular all these persons that have been up there since Methuselah was born and won't leave, as if they have not exhausted all the remedies they would have gone to Washington with and all things they went there to do, as if they have not done it by now, and they serve and they want to run 4 and 5 terms and go for a 6th term, as if they don't have anything else that they can do with their lives other than stand up there in policy-making positions really as if they have anything else to offer after all those years have been up there. We're going to, anyway, they're going to have a rally asking them to stand down, and those that can hear out there, I'm going to be out there, but those that can't hear the voices out there, we're going to get you to stand down by going to the polls in November and standing you down through the vote process, because some people in Washington got the lead. And this has nothing to do with race and being against somebody because of color. We need to just stop this narrative that's playing in our head, and we're voicing it. This narrative is playing out in America. And to be honest with you, you can watch any of these films they're putting on TV during Black History Month, and just look at what the fight was about during a time when they were fighting for changes in the South, for example. And very little of it had to do with trying to transform the country in some fundamental way that this president's talking about. We just have to get a few people out of the way and let the American people and their sense of fairness come through. And really, we had to fight to get the politicians out of the way, which is what we are fighting for right now. And if that's what they're coming to Washington with, that's what they're fighting for. That fight continues. And it's time we understood that has been the fight over the long run. I came here today to talk about, and I'm wearing, my, this is, I got this top from Africa when I was made an Igbo chief in 2009. This is not an honorary position. I am an Igbo chief in full standing in Nigeria. And the Igbos, which are located in the southeastern part in the Delta region of Nigeria. I was there in 2009, and I was given a great honor of becoming a chief, going through all the rituals, and am a chief in full standing, not an honorary chief, by the way, but a full chief in full standing with the Igbo, which is one of many groups that they have in Nigeria. The Yoruba being on the west side, central west part of Nigeria, but in the southeastern part, that's where the Igbo group pretty much is situated, and that's where I was when they gave me this great honor. So given this is Black History Month, and we'll spend some time, we'll let the dynamics of the program lead us where we have to go, but I do want to say a few words about Black history, since it's Black History Month. And I think next week what I'll be wearing is probably a hat from the university. Not that I'll be speaking the university's name, but I want to make sure that we don't get caught up in this idea that we are more African than we are. But I think we pay some homage to the origination point, but at the same time, let's understand that identity is not only where you once were and your origination point way back when your ancestors came from a continent to the United States, but where are you now? Because both of these things have something to do with your present identity, which is made up of not only where are you from, but where are you at the present time. And it's a combination of those two things, African and then American, is to say that there's a historic origin and there's also a social location.
Maybe this is a point of question, but was there a large percentage of Igbo speakers or Igbo people that were brought into the North American continent through the slave trade, or was it that was a pretty high number of people from that group, right?
Yeah, the Igbo, the first person that wrote a novel, the first black person to write a novel and to write really an autobiography, I should say, in the Western Hemisphere was Igbo, and his autobiography, which is in 2 volumes, is really a classic. You may have heard of him as Gustavus Vasa, also known as Olaudah Equiano. And when I went to some of the king's palaces in Nigeria, I saw a picture on the wall of Gustavus Vasa, also known as Equiano. I saw a picture of him on one of the walls. When I identified that picture, the guy said, one of the persons said, "Oh, you're aware of Gustavus Vasa. And I told him that I was aware of him, and I knew he was the person that had written an autobiography of his life. And he did talk in that autobiography in Volume 1 about having been kidnapped in Nigeria as an Igbo chief. But he made it clear that the kidnappers were, in fact, those from another ethnic group from within the African continent itself. And that just gives you another view of the African slave trade, which really was a trade that was internally driven. And without that component of it, it would never have occurred. And you can say what you want to about it, but those are the facts. The slave trade in Africa was internally driven. And if it had not been so, we're talking here about 1441 or 1444, the 15th century, and this is before the armaments, the superior armaments that you had in Europe. And if anybody thinks in the 15th century that you're going to carry those muskets into the interior part of Africa and then conquer anything, that is not what was possible, and it did not happen that way. The European slave trade had to do with an internal trade, and the trading of those persons were in fact brought to those boats and to those forts built upon the coastal region of Africa, where I was and have been in many of them. And those castles, those forts are on the coastal region. And I've talked to some of the professors, by the way, in Wayne State University. There's a professor down there, had some conversations with, and he's been over there and refused to acknowledge what it was that he saw. But what he saw and what I told him he saw, for example, at Castle Amina in Ghana, in Accra, I told him what you saw was those cannons that were on the shores of Africa aimed out toward the waters. And if they were, in fact, setting those cannons up to, in fact, conquer the the person on the continent of Africa, those cannons would have been pointed toward the interior of Africa. They're pointed out toward the waters. And they're pointed out that way because they are to keep the other Europeans who were, in fact, competing for having involvement in the slave trade at the coastal region. They're keeping them away from that because this is where the sphere of influence was, for example, by the Portuguese, and later on by the Dutch, who replaced the Portuguese, and then of course the British got involved in it, so did the French and the Spanish, and so on and so forth.
So it was the Portuguese at first that did that, right?
The Portuguese were the first,
yeah,
and they built the first fort there. Fort Amina would be built by the Portuguese, but taken over later on by the Dutch, who defeated the Portuguese. But that contract they had with the chief in Ghana, that contract they had was in which they had with the Oyo or the Dinka Ira. That contract was then signed between them and the new slave traders from Europe, and that would be the Dutch, who that was, I think, in let me get the date right, that's around 1652.
So it's already, the slave trade has already flown on for a couple hundred years at that point then.
The slave trade would have started, it depends on when you want to date it. If you want to date it when they had 200 blacks go into Europe, you dated at 1441. And then when you're talking about a much wider slave trade, first of all, 10 went back to Portugal. That would be 1441. Then a larger group, 200, went to Portugal in 1444, 3 years later. Now, the slave trade we talk about is not that slave trade, which is going across the Atlantic Ocean also. That's the Atlantic Ocean being used there also. But the one we're talking about in terms of slave trade is the one that transverses the Atlantic Ocean and comes across into the Western Hemisphere. And that slave trade is a little bit later. It has to be after Columbus had, quote unquote, discovered America. And those who are arguing about who discovered it first, what we have to keep in mind is that it's not quantifiably of any importance in terms of the impact it has upon the world until 1492, because then the transformation that is now beginning to take place will take place because of that particular exploration engaged in by Cristobal Colon, which is his Italian name, but Cristobal Colon being the anglicized name of the explorer, the great explorer, who came to the Americas on 4 different occasions. But we have to go back and look at how the slave trade itself materialized, and I think Basil Davidson is absolutely, I don't have to think about it, he's absolutely correct in changing the title of his book from Black Mother, and he changed the title to The African Slave Trade. He didn't call it the European slave trade, he called it the African slave trade, because the African slave trade is how you define that trade in terms of who was actually in back of it and who's actually driving that trade. If that trade is not being driven by Africans at that particular point in time, then that trade would not have occurred. And I'm quoting people from the continent, no matter what they're saying about it over here, where there's this political correctness, where they want to state more than what the evidence shows. The slave trade, as Akosha Purby, who is a historian in Ghana, which is formerly called the Gold Coast up until 1957, when Kwame Nkrumah became the first president of the independent Ghana, having gotten its independence in 1957, the same year as the Civil Rights Bill was passed here under the Eisenhower administration. And 3 years after it had been promised, which was 1954, which is the year in which you had the Brown versus Board of Education case. So there's movement going on in terms of this loosening of the tentacles of the vestiges of slavery and colonialism going on in both places, both North America and also in Africa at the same time. You have this movement taking place, and we have looking at history from the standpoint of what actually happened. And what really happened was that the slave trade was energized. It was, in fact, conjured up by the people on the continent of Africa. I would even refer people to another Ghanaian writer who is in the United States right now. He's from Ghana, and I'm sure he'll be returning there once he retires. He's working, and I think now he's at, I don't think he's at Columbia University anymore, but he's been around a couple of universities. A person by the name of George Yitte, who has 4 major books out, some minor books out as well, but some of the major books he has out, one of which is called Indigenous African Institutions. And the one I'd like to refer you to that talks about the slave trade, and I'll give you the page number of this book. This book is called Africa Unchained. And you need to read page 105 of that book by George Yitte. And what he writes there is going to surprise you, because he's going to be talking about another slave trade we don't talk about too much, and that's one that was much more horrendous, which is the one he's talking about in terms of slave trade that went on in the East, where they took blacks out of West Africa and other parts of Africa, went across the Sahara and went in the eastern direction, which none of them can be found, by the way, which is page 93 of the book written by Brigitte Gabriel in her book called They Must Be Stopped, which is one of her 2 books. Look on page 93 of that book and read where she asks this question: Why is there no black culture in these Eastern Arabic countries? Why is there no black culture there? Because 20 million blacks went across the Sahara Desert in the opposite direction. We don't talk about that, but Yitte talks about it in his book called Africa Unchained. And we don't want to talk about that slave trade because it doesn't make the indictment that we make over here in the Western Hemisphere, because we're trying to make an indictment and we are refusing to look at the historical record so as to be even-handed in the claims that we make. But I'm saying here with my Igbo background that I'm here to talk about the facts. I'm not here to make an indictment. I'm here to talk about what the historical record would support. And I was sitting next to a historian by the name of Akosha Purby, who would back me up in having made this claim that this was internally driven. Because I sat next to Akosha Purby when I was in Ghana in 2006. And I was there, I think I was there in Ghana for 15 days. I visited several of the forts. There are approximately 60 forts, slave forts that were built in Africa. And I've been in quite a few of those. And I know for a fact that the premise that we have here in the West is incorrect about why those forts existed and how they were built, and what permission had to be obtained in order for them to be built, because nobody just went in there and just kicked the doors in and started building on African land. And there are no forts, by the way, built into the interior. That's another question people ought to ask. Why are those forts on the coastal region? And the reason that is true is because that's where Europeans were restricted to in terms of their access. They were not going to go into the interior part of Africa and get those slaves and capture those slaves themselves, because the middleman would be cut out. And there was a capture. There was the king involved at that level. Then there's a middleman that's involved in it, and the person is actually doing the trading with the European, who is kept on the coastal region. Those are facts, and you can make all kinds of claims. You cannot prove it based upon the evidence. And George Ayete is one of the more clear writers about it. But I don't just quote those persons. I would tell you to read. I don't want you to have to read the whole books. I have to go through these whole books. I mean, I've had students ask me at the university, because I brought the Anacalypsis in there one time. This book, the Anacalypsis is like this wide, and the pages are like this right here, and it's like, I forget how many pages in volume 1, but that's like 600 pages probably in the first volume, and another 400 pages in the second volume. And the book was all marked up, and one of my students said, "Did you read all that?" I gave her the book and said, "You think I went through that?" Because I had underscored most of the information in there, which was written by Godfrey Higgins in 1836, and he wrote volume 2 in 1837. But I would even refer you to Thomas Sowell's book. I think that's that book he wrote on slavery, which is called The Real Story of Slavery, page 111 of that book. You don't have to read the whole book, the book is called, listen to the title of this book, it's called Black Rednecks and White Liberals. When Foxworthy said, you might be a redneck, well, you might think that and he's not talking about the way we use the word in the South, but Thomas Sowell's book is called Black Rednecks, and I suggest you read that book. But if you don't read the whole book, read chapter 4, which is a book on slavery, and page 111 of that book in particular, because that's where he really gets into the real story of slavery. And what he says is that if you take all of the things that happen on this side of the Atlantic Ocean as far as the slave trade is concerned, all the person that died on the way to the Western Hemisphere and things of that sort, you would not have even examined 10% of the horrors of slavery that were in fact in history, because 90% of the horrors of slavery had nothing to do with the slave trade to the Western Hemisphere. So take that as another way of looking at Black History Month.
Well, the word term slave actually is an invention that the people who we call Slavic nowadays in Middle Eastern Europe and Central Europe were the slaves of Vikings and other people. And that's where they got the word. It was expanded to all people who were, forced to labor for others. But the word slave comes from Slav. I mean, that goes to show you that it was a European, or at least the, Central European part of the world. That was already the reality for a large portion of the population there.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and you're making an excellent point, because if it were more primary to the continent of Africa than it was elsewhere, and was primary only in a single place, it would wear that name of that particular group. Then if it were so much one group against as far as another, then why don't we have some name that names an institution from that group then would be primary? The word Slavic, which is Czechoslovakia, that's in the name. There are some other names that you have with the word Slavic in it. We said Czechoslovakia, obviously, that would be one part of it. But look at Eastern Europe in general, and don't forget that there are other words for slaves also, such as the word serfs. And we could even say the word over here, which is indentured servant, which is another way. I mean, there's a contract, so there's an ending to the servitude. But the word indentured servitude means that you are a slave but you're able to work yourself out of the condition because there's a contract that you have to fulfill, and once the contract is fulfilled, then enslavement is in fact over. And that's how it started out over here, as a matter of fact, when the first blacks arrived here, according to the book written by Lerone Bennett. One of his books is called Before the Mayflower. The first 20 blacks that came here on a Dutch ship, and that's another way we look at the Dutch as far as them being involved in the slave trade, and that's now been forgotten somewhat, but they took over from the Portuguese, and now they're bringing people over here. And on the Dutch ship, the first 20 blacks arrived in North America as indentured servants, and were in fact released after a period of time after their servitude had been served. They were indentured servants. They weren't slaves in the way we look at the developing institution, which was developing in America. But you know what? The institution of slavery was already developed elsewhere. It was developing over time in America, and it was not fully formed when the Declaration of Independence was written and drawn up. It wasn't fully formed at that point. It was continuing to be developed. And when the framers wrote these things in the Constitution, they were writing all men are created equal and putting the paradigm out there so that when the time period came for that idea to be put into full force and effect, the idea was already institutionalized in the country. You can't always act upon your enlightenment and your understanding because not everybody has an enlightenment and understanding. But if you put the idea out there, people grow up into the idea. And that's what happened in this country. But the other idea was already formed on the other continents because it was practiced as an institution from way back where you can't even go and get a date for its beginning point.
Actually, in human societies, slavery or servitude or forced servitude was probably considered the norm. I mean, let's face it. I mean, we rhapsodize about the king. We have this guy image of him being always benevolent. Kings were brutal, and the knights weren't these great individuals. They were thugs for the king. They got rewarded for their service to the king. Mm-hmm. The king couldn't be a threat to everybody, so you had other people to spread the threats around. Mm-hmm. So I mean, anybody who thinks enslavement of other people was the norm in the world. The only way we became developed, where we actually started valuing the individual, bizarre enough, this is going to really tick out the progressives, is by becoming a more consumer-based society.
Yes.
Where you actually had appeal and make appeals to people's taste, and so they could deliberately and voluntarily purchase stuff. So, I mean, slavery, anybody who's against the capitalism actually has got to be asked, do you want us to be capitulated back into slavery?
Yeah, because that's what the other systems will in fact do. If you take socialism to its end, it turns into communism. In fact, it's an intermediary to the step between capitalism and communism will be socialism. And you're talking about statism. And statism has always ended up in tyranny and enslavement. You're just not particularizing what group you are talking about being enslaved. It would be the society itself is enslaved. So we would be moving toward that which has enslaved societies in the past, and away from that which has freed people. The capitalist system is what ended slavery as a practice throughout the world because it's untenable to have slavery and have capitalism at the same time. The two don't go together. It does go together in a social society, and it goes together in a communist society, which is why all the persons in communist societies have been enslaved. Unless they've been moving back toward a free market kind of practice, then the entire societies are enslaved. And you can look at some evidence of it right now. I mean, who's free in Cuba? And who's really free what they have in the Olympics over there? These are totalitarian societies, and therefore they're not free societies. The only free societies that you've had are those that have been operative upon two premises, one of which is private property. And private property pretends and gives license to individual rights, because if you don't have property rights, you can't have individual rights, and that can only exist in a society that is in fact capitalist. You go back and look in history and see the formation of capitalism, and then see that it also brought about the end and the resolution to the institution of slavery. Plus, there was a philosophical aspect to it. And that was that, and we don't want to talk too much about this because it gives credit to the West, but look at the fact that the philosophers, John Locke and others, and some of Hobbes and people of that sort, and many other writers, are arguing in the West about the the tenets of freedom. Those ideals are born in the West, and and when they're carried into Africa, by the way, and they are now saying to even to those in Africa, the slave trade must come to an end. The person in Africa, the kings, they are asking, how can it be right the other day and it's being wrong right now, and how can we stop it after having practiced it over the course of so many years? And it had to be forced upon the continent to have it stopped, because it was a lucrative trade for those in the continent, those that were capturing others and selling them into slavery. That could not have happened unless there were some ethnic groups on the continent doing that. And for those that say things like, and this is really ridiculous when you hear it, if you understand what really went on in history, when those persons say that, as they said in one of the Gates pieces, Henry Louis Gates did a piece in 2000 called Wonders of the African World, and in part 2, I think it was, where he did it on the slave kingdoms, Gates took a group of Americans, black Americans, into Castle Amina. And the guy was the one that you have a guide in those slave castles, and they explain to you the history and so on and so forth. So here are these blacks going to Africa. They expect to go there to have their idea of what really happened in slave trade validated. And they go in there and they hear this guy talking, saying the Africans were capturing others, yes, and so they came out they came out there shell shocked. And Gates goes out and they out there now standing outside, and he asked them on camera, well, what'd you think? And so some of the black Americans were saying, well, what surprised us is that we were selling our own people. And, I just have to, really marvel over those kinds of naive, really ridiculous comments. But you can't know it's ridiculous until you understand what really went on, not what we say went on, what really happened in history. And the reason why that statement is ridiculous is because Africans are just as diverse, if not more so, than they are in Europe. And nobody would make a claim that Hitler was, in fact, attacking Austrians or Germans by attacking London. I mean, was he attacking his own people when he attacked Great Britain and had Churchill out there reading this poem, since the Black History Month, reading this poem by Claude McKay called "If We Must Die"? That's a poem written by Claude McKay in the Renaissance period, and when Hitler attacked London, trying to bring them down to their knees because they could not get the British, the people in England, to yield because there was a 21-mile barrier between continental Europe and the British Isles. They were not going to yield, and Churchill got it on the radio, and he said, "If we must die, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us though dead."
What's ironic, too, is that if you look at British history, the family who actually sits in the royal seats right now are descendants from Germanic people, the Hanoverian lineage. So, I mean, these Germans, the Nazis, were attacking people who could, for all practical purposes, bend their relatives.
Yeah, there is a. Now, if you want to go back into the ancestral past, you can see links here. But in terms of what Hitler was doing, nobody has ever made any contention that I am aware of, and I've read many of the books on that period of history, including the masterpiece, which was written by the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, and also the book written by, and some of these names are missing out of my memory right now, but
that was written by Will Schreier.
Yeah,
I read that when I was in high school. Yeah,
that's a great book. Now, that's a Bible there. This big thing of something like 1,300 pages,
and it gets into a lot of the Nazi ideology and everything.
That's a masterpiece. You really can't know German history until you read William Schreier's book. That is a masterpiece. And then I read what's that book that is written by one of the persons that was tried at Nuremberg, and he wrote a book about it too. I can't think of the name of his book right now, but I read that book as well.
There's Hess, and there was not Hess. What was his name?
It wasn't Hess.
No, what was it? Spear, Albert Speer.
Albert Speer.
Yeah, Albert Speer.
Yeah, John, you never cease to amaze me. But those books are must read. But nobody's ever made a claim that Hitler was attacking his own people. Although we can say that if you go back far enough, you can see some ancestral links in terms of they had to go through Europe to arrive at the northern part, and most of it would have been by land, and then you go across the English Channel, 21 miles into where you have the British Isles, and you could see some linkage if you go back far enough. But Hitler doesn't see himself as attacking his own people; he's attacking the British, and he intends to bring them to their knees. And Churchill had an answer for him. The answer was the answer that Claude McKay had written about it in 1919, when those black soldiers came back from World War I. He said that, "Oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain."
You know what's ironic about it too is like World War II took place after so many years after the First World War, but the victor during the time of the First World War, the Tsar of Russia, the King of England, and the Kaiser of Germany were all first cousins to each other through Victoria, Queen Victoria of England. So it seems like so rapidly these people forgot that these actually, and then they changed the name to create that, pull it out of nowhere, the House of Windsor, because they can't admit that when they're fighting a war against the Germans, that they're actually the House of Hanover, that they're fighting, all these British people are now dying for. They're actually German. I mean, but that was so quickly forgotten.
It was forgotten, and Hanover would be the family tree in which King George III's wife, Charlotte Sophia, would have come from. You know her from the fact that she had 15 children by King George III, 9 boys and 6 girls, one of whom was Edward VI. And Edward VI is the father of Queen Victoria. And so that Hanover line goes all the way back into that part of Europe, and that connects the Germans up with the British. In fact, the first 2 Georges in England spoke German. They didn't speak English. George III was the first one to speak English, and so this idea that, and all the links, quite frankly, are, all family links are all family units are linked if you go back far enough in the time, because there's only one family, that's a human family. But we need to go back and get this history straight, because until we understand, and I said this about the civil rights movement the same way, until we understand the slave trade, we really can't get a whole lot that happened afterwards straight, because we have the foundational moments of that which caused the present. We don't have the foundational points straight. In other words, to see this as victimization, where one group victimized another, and without seeing it as a participatory kind of event, I think it just simply clouds us into what we're dealing with at the present time, because there's no innocence here. And this argument can be made about the civil rights movement the same way, which is an argument, by the way, that's being made by Shelby Steele in his book called White Guilt. And then the subtitle is How Blacks and Whites Together Destroyed the Promises of the Civil Rights Movement. This idea that you're going to be pointing fingers and making an indictment as if there's some innocence on the part of any one group is really nonsense, and it just shows how far off base that we are. So I would say that during this month, rather than to be studying Black history, make an indictment, we should be studying Black history to find out what really happened, to find out how the family unit itself breaks down from time to time, and different groups situated differently will in fact act in an exploitative way, and we have to all be on guard to be vigilant to stop those kinds of things from taking place, because the human personality is in fact warped, and it is capable of doing horrendous things under certain conditions. That's everybody.
You know, I'm a kind of a theologically based person, and I look at all this stuff, the idea of the slave trade, and the outcome of that. It's still impacting our society. Name calling and expectations, and they want people to feel guilty for something. And basically, the idea of the fall of mankind is most clearly demonstrated throughout history. It's one of the most easily proven theological concepts, because everybody thinks, why did this happen? Why do we let this happen? Why was this going? These people. And basically, it's because of hard-heartedness, because we're so cut off, so we're so zealous for just materialistic gain. We didn't examine why we were doing what we did, and that means there's something seriously wrong with the human race to allow this to happen at the larger scale.
Yeah. Well, you know what, John, that argument is one I was listening to before I came to the studio today, and that argument was one that I was hearing being debated between Hitchens and Dinesh D'Souza. They had a debate on religion, and of course, Hitchens was, since he's deceased now, was an atheist, and D'Souza was bringing up the religious aspect to human existence. And one of the points he made, and I think it was a brilliant point that he brought into that discussion, was where he said that if, in fact, you say evolution is the reason why human beings exist, then how do you explain then that there is this evil that exists? In other words, if you have only evolution, then how then do you have this notion of good and evil in the human experience, since right and wrong would not be something that would be part of the evolutionary design? That is, say, you would just be doing this without any other possibility because you would evolve in a certain way. And he was talking about the conscience part being an aspect of it. And I don't explain it as well as he did, but he was making some perfect sense in terms of saying there are too many other things that are involved in the equation. And he said, as far as why people mistreat each other, then that is a part of the human will and human freedom that has been given, and to give God to claim to indict God for something that human beings themselves have decided to do is fundamentally unfair, because you have the ability to make these decisions to do X, Y, and Z, and there's no, you can do the other thing, but you can also do the other thing over here on the other side as well. And there's no restraint other than the restraints you place upon yourself. But there's something inside of you, though, that also speaks to that other thing. That is, say, you may do something wrong, but what D'Souza was saying is, where is that voice coming from that says that may not be exactly the way that should have played out? Where does that come from? That's another voice. So where does that come from? And you just can't say it's just evolution that is there. Something is internal to the cellular makeup, is what he was arguing. But we are all capable of it, and when we make a big mistake thinking that wrongdoing can be assigned to a particular group to exclusion of other groups, and make a mistake in trying to quantify human behavior as existing only in one part of the human population. All of us are capable of these kinds of things. We'll be very vigilant about it. And I heard that argument when Tutu's daughter came here, spoke at the University of Michigan, and she said that we were in South Africa thinking that, well, look at what they're doing and blah blah blah. She said, but it dawned upon me that when I began to think about what had occurred there, that we're all capable of that. Everybody is capable of that kind of abuse of power.
Look at Hannah Arendt. She wrote that book after she did the Eichmann trial. She said she just saw him. She saw this evil man, Eichmann, brought to trial. Mm-hmm. She was close contact with this individual. And she was just so utterly shocked by the banality of evil. This man was just like a weak human being, who, used the bathroom and, gulped down water and felt threatened and stuff like this. And then she was like so shocked because when you see this kind of evil being manifested, way their actions are manifested, you have a tendency to put this power to them. And when you see that they are just a rather putrid human, very basic, very, very weak human.
Weak human, and we have to make sure we're looking at it as a human experience and as a human frailty. Because once you start making it appear to be something peculiar to a particular group, you actually are claiming moral hegemony among one group to the exclusion of other groups. And once you start segmenting humanity that way, you have actually introduced an aspect of Hitlerism into human thought. That there are some moral high grounds for some groups denied to other groups. And if you start making an argument, you're making the argument of the person that you are allegedly were critiquing, and yet you're emulating the same kinds of ideas that is being critiqued. And that's fundamentally a problem, because if we're going to ascend the weaknesses that we've seen in history, and we're going to transcend that in present and future times, we got to understand that this was a collective fault and frailty that we all are capable of being involved in, and there are no big I's and little U's. It's all of us in this equation together. And if we're going to overcome the human weaknesses that we've seen in the past, we're going to have to do that together. We cannot do it by segmenting that this is the problem of one group and it doesn't have anything to do with this other group over here. That's a fundamental mistake. And a mistake, I would say, during Black History Month that I think the Afrocentrists have made in terms of them making this foundational point of view, that there are some, that in history there is a group that did certain things and nobody else was involved in it. Yet they claimed they were involved in all the other people's history, but nobody was involved in theirs. And that's a fundamental mistake. If I came here today, and I'll bring it back next week to continue this, but I brought this book called World's Great Men of Color, and I was going to read some of these names to you and where they were. And they wouldn't have a problem with that. They would say that, for example, the first chapter in the book, this is volume 2, Saint Maurice of Aganon. And it says here, Roman general and saint of the Catholic Church that lived around AD, circa AD 287. And they would have no problem with that. And then the next chapter is Benedict the Moor, and he's a saint of the Catholic Church, 1524 to 1589. It's an AD period. And they would have no problem saying that he was playing a role in Europe. But when you get to Africa, all of a sudden, nobody was there but black people. And see that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that if you're going to correct if Black History Month is going to mean anything about being a corrective of history, it cannot make the mistake of serving as a critique while making a mistake of that which is being criticized. You can't critique it and then move into the space that you are claiming is wrong, and then move into space and then substitute that paradigm for the one that you're critiquing. It doesn't make any sense to me. And I think we have to. You can use this mind as a corrective, but make sure that you're then doing it through not getting into another ism, but what is the truth? What really happened here? And we talked about the slave trade. We'll talk about some other things next week, because I want to get into some understandings in the 1920s, and I want to bring up some of the things that were being said in this country and where it goes back into history and show that they were more clear about it then in 1920 than they are now, something like 80 years later. John, you help us assign how much time we had. I didn't see. We got 2 minutes. So I think we have to use this month, but I think we have to use it to bring more light than what we bring in, and we're bringing a lot of heat to the conversation, not enough light to the conversation. Rather than getting into these isms and osms, history should be history should be not just his story, which is in her story, and get into these ethnic dispensations of history, and also these gender dispensations of history, because J.E. Rogers, as great as he was as a historian, the one who wrote this book called World's Great Men of Color, I mean, look, he's talking about world's great men of color. He's not. There are a few women in these 2 volumes, but not many, because here he was writing as a male, and that's not true either. I mean, the men weren't just back there by themselves. There were women back there too. And in many ways, women were playing a major role. We can go and look at that, but we have to get the whole story straight. And Black History Month allows us to enlarge upon the compass and to expand upon our understanding of history, so that we can get more information involved in the drama of what happened, so we can understand why we are in the position we're in right now in the United States and other parts of the world. We should not be, in fact, making the mistakes we made in the past. And this month should not be used to segment the population, because it was really introduced in 1926 by Carter G. Woodson to make the pattern of the human experience much wider and much more applicable to all the groups. And then to use it for an opposite reason, I think is disingenuous to the founder of this month. So we'll be back for the next 2 weeks, and we'll continue this discussion next Monday and the Monday thereafter, and we'll close out the Black History Month trying to bring some history to the table that seems to be forgotten by those who claim to be its progenitors and its protectors, and we'll try to get the record a little bit more on in the public square. Until next time, I want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you will never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.